Epistemology, the science of knowing what we know. It all sounds very esoteric, but it's actually incredibly practical, even in something as simple as taking the dog for a walk. We're going to explore all of these alternative ways of knowing in the context of navigation, because to take the dog for a walk is an act of navigation. We need to know where we're going to go and how we're going to get there and how we're going to get home. But first of all, we kind of even need to know where we are. When we think of navigation, probably the first thing we think of is a map, like a bird's eye view, as though we could fly up into the sky and see the world from that perspective. Well, welcome to Science Extension. We're exploring epistemology and the different ways that we come to know about the world, and we're doing so in the particular context of navigation. So, what are all the different ways in which we come to know what we know? Well, one is we use our senses, so empirical knowing. There's also cultural knowing, as information gets passed down between the generations. And then there's rational thinking. If this is true and this is true, therefore this must be true. Critical thinking, working things out. And then there's intuition, these flashes of insight that we have, and science is studded with wonderful examples of just a flash of insight. I can think of Mendeleev in his invention of the periodic table as being an incredible leap of genius that came out of nowhere. And then there's technological ways of knowing. Technology helps us make empirical measurements, that's true as well, but also technology brings us a new way of knowing, a new type of knowing. Think about the development of the microscope and how that would have blown our minds. There's this whole world, this whole universe of living things out there that we weren't even aware of. We had no knowing of them except through technology. And of course, as we express ourselves as human beings in literature, in great visual art, in dance, in song and music, we come to understand the world in a different kind of way as well. So here's a really early map, not the earliest map, and we can think about how do all these ways of knowing contribute to this particular form of navigation? Well, obviously there would have been empirical ways of knowing. People would have walked between the different parts of the city and noted what direction it was. There would have been some rational thinking. Well, it took me longer to get here than it did to get here, so they must be further apart and I could represent them. In fact, though, that moment when the first person took that incredible leap of insight to realize that they could scratch on a tusk of an animal some scratchings that represented reality and that would convey important information to other people, that's an amazing flash of insight. And of course, all maps are an act of art because they're not reality. They reflect aspects of reality that are important depending upon the perspective of the person who wants to use them. And that's a great example where the actual location of those things is not geographically accurate, and yet it's still a really useful map. Now, our indigenous people were great travelers and often made huge journeys, sometimes through really dry and inhospitable lands. And they used some incredible ideas to navigate and to pass on that information, that cultural knowledge about navigation. And so they used star maps in the sky as like a memory aid for the story of how to get from A to B. And in storylines and songlines, that information was coded. Absolutely genius. If she just smiled and gave me a Vegemite, you could probably finish the words. In fact, if you've got a favourite song and someone starts humming it, you can probably think of all of the words of that song. So they're really incredible ways to encode sequential information like the location of the waterholes and the safe passage across mountain ranges. So they became this incredible technology that Indigenous people used to navigate. So once you've got a map, there's still that knowing where you are on the map. Now, when you're on land and there's landforms around and things that you can recognize, that helps to locate you on the map. It's another whole level of difficulty, though, when we leave the land and venture out into the sea. So sailors used a form of intuition, intuitive knowing. They called dead reckoning. And once they'd left the last sighting of land where they kind of knew they were, they just used their gut reaction, their gut feeling. They might have thrown a log in the water and measured how quickly it was moving along. So they would have taken some empirical measurements, but largely it was just kind of guesswork. And the development of the compass, though, massively helped that. So where did the development of the compass come from? Well, we can trace that back to ancient China. So a form of cultural knowledge, the lodestone, and then later on pieces of iron that get magnetized by lodestones, were used to give you a direction, point to north. Really, really handy around the equator, not so good as you get closer to the poles, but nevertheless gave people a north-south. So here's another technological development that was a result of cultural transmission of knowledge and helped us to make much better empirical measurements. The next invention that helped to give us a better sense of knowing where we are on the map, compasses are great, they tell you which direction you're heading, they don't tell you where you are. The next invention was the invention of the sextant, which is an instrument for taking accurate empirical measurements of where celestial bodies are above the horizon. Of course, you've got to combine that empirical measurement with a rational, deductive way of knowing, a model of how those bodies move in the sky to tell you where you are. And so combine all those three together and you get a really good position of where you are in terms of latitude. That's your north-south position. Not very useful for telling where you are east-west. And so sailors continued to use dead reckoning to go east and west. And after many, many tragic losses of life, the British Navy finally decided that they would post a huge reward, thousands of pounds reward, for someone who could solve the problem of longitude. Longitude required a very, very accurate chronometer, something that could measure time, and measure time on a pitching and lurching sailing ship over many, many days and months. And a guy by the name of Harrison, John Harrison, came up with an invention. So this was another technological invention and accurate timekeeping. And his was accurate, even back then, to 3 seconds a day. That's an amazing level of accuracy. And that unlocked another level of knowing that longitudinal position of where you are on the map, combined again with those rational models. So we've seen how the development of navigation, and it's been a pretty quick journey through the development of navigation, we've seen how that uses all these alternative ways of knowing over the eons to develop where we are right now. And even with GPS, that is based upon Einstein's special and general relativity. A flash of insight that he made from observing the universe and applying a lot of rational and logical thought once he'd worked out what those first premises would be. That's really, really important because our GPS system would not work or would be very, very inaccurate if we didn't allow for Einstein's general relativity. Plus, it's built upon a whole lot of other technological developments before that. So, as a case in point, navigation's a great example of this science of epistemology, of the different ways that we know about the universe. And I just want to pick 3 of those because they're ones that persist as a bit of a theme through the rest of this module. Rational thought, we think of that as deductive reasoning. If A and B are true, therefore this thing must be true. There's empirical measurement, and from that, we do inductive reasoning. So we make measurements of a small set and we assume that the bigger thing is like that. And the last one, which isn't really explicitly mentioned in the syllabus, but it's really important as well, and that is this abductive reasoning. This is the appeal to the most logical. In a sense, there's a level of intuition behind this. It does actually appear in the syllabus in the form of Occam's razor, the appeal to the explanation that requires the invention of the least number of extra factors. The simpler solution is often the best. So it's useful to remember with all of these different ways of knowing, as they're not mutually exclusive and there's not really some definitive list, but it's still helpful to think about the different ways which we know what we know. And in fact, knowledge and understanding is enhanced as those different knowledge systems are used. In fact, my hat has got NALSMA on it, which came out of a cooperative research centre that my brother was a senior leader in the top end. And it was about bringing together Indigenous and scientific knowledge systems to create opportunities for Indigenous Australians. So things often work better together.